It was a night drenched in silence, broken only by the distant hum of sirens far across the hills of Long Island. Inside a mansion that stood like a fortress, Alexander Moretti paced the marble hallway with fury burning in his chest. He wasn't just any man. He was the most feared mafia billionaire on the East Coast. He had built an empire from blood, secrets, and cold strategy. But tonight, all of that power fell hollow. In his hand, he clutched a photograph. One of his men had taken it earlier that day. His wife, Isabella, locked in the arms of a younger man, her lips on the stranger's neck, her wedding ring still glinting on her finger. Alexander felt like the air had been sucked from the room. He had trusted her, loved her, at least, as much as a man like him could love anyone. She was his piece, his art in a world painted in red. But betrayal was a currency he never tolerated, not from enemies, and certainly not from the woman he called his wife. Across the estate, in the servant quarters, a quiet man named Elijah sat sharpening kitchen knives, not for violence, but as part of his routine. Elijah had worked for Moretti for 17 years. A tall, strong black man in his 50s, Elijah had seen and heard things most people would run from. But his loyalty never wavered. He owed Alexander his life. Moretti had once pulled him from the streets, given him a home, a purpose, and protected his family. Elijah had a rule: never ask questions, never speak unless spoken to, never forget who you serve. But even he could feel the energy shift in the mansion that night. Upstairs in the master suite, Isabella walked in wearing a silk gown and a smirk, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that her husband already knew. She sauntered toward him, but the air grew cold when she saw the photo in his hand. "What is this?" she said, but her voice lacked surprise. "You tell me," Alexander hissed. She scoffed. "You spy on me now? After everything I've put up with? Your blood deals, your dirty money, the lies you've told." He slapped the photograph down onto the table. "And this is how you repay me?" Her eyes narrowed. "I stopped loving you a long time ago, Alex. You might own this house, but you never owned me." His jaw clenched. "I gave you everything, and I wanted love, not power." Those were her last words. In one cold, irreversible moment, Alexander drew the pistol from his belt and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed like thunder through the mansion. Isabella crumpled to the floor, lifeless, blood pooling beneath her. Downstairs, Elijah froze. He'd heard that sound too many times, and in his bones, he knew it had come from the master bedroom. Without hesitation, he sprinted up the staircase. He found Alexander standing over Isabella's body, breathing heavily, eyes glazed over with a mix of rage and regret. "Elijah," Alexander whispered, as if waking from a dream. Elijah didn't ask questions. "What happened, sir?" "She cheated," Alexander muttered. "She betrayed me." Elijah looked down at the body, then back up at the man who had once saved him from death. "Go," Alexander said. "Leave. I'll call my lawyers." But Elijah didn't move. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, down the hallway, and out the front door. He went straight to the gate and waved at the mansion guards. "Call the cops," he said. "Tell them there's been a murder." By the time NYPD arrived, Elijah had blood on his hands, deliberately placed from lifting Isabella's body, and calmly stood on the front steps. Detectives swarmed the scene. The mansion was searched, the firearm recovered from a hidden compartment in the master suite. Alexander remained silent during the investigation. His lawyers handled the rest. They spun a narrative about Elijah being mentally unstable, emotionally obsessed with Isabella. Elijah didn't contest it. Not once. In court, Elijah pled guilty to second-degree murder. His sentence, 25 years in prison. He took it with dignity. In the courtroom, as the sentence was read, Alexander didn't even look at him. 8 years later, Detective Marissa Hall sipped her coffee while reviewing old case files in the cold case division. Her instincts had always been sharp, and something about the Moretti murder never sat right with her. Elijah's record was clean, his demeanor stable, and the confession too clean, too convenient. That morning, she pulled up security footage from the mansion that had never been thoroughly reviewed. likely buried under Alexander Moretti's legal reach. Hours into the footage, she found something. A backup server captured audio from the hallway outside the master suite. The voices were faint but decipherable. "You might own this house, but you never owned me." Then the gunshot. Then footsteps. A second later, Alexander's voice, "Elijah." That was enough. Detective Hall got a warrant. She reopened the case. But by the time the arrest order for Alexander Moretti was signed and the task force gathered, it was too late. Back at the mansion, it was sunset when the police convoy rolled up the long driveway of Moretti's estate. Dozens of agents, armed and prepared, stormed the property. They found Alexander seated in his study, staring at an old photo of Isabella and himself in happier times. As officers swarmed in, Alexander stood slowly. "I always knew this day might come," he said quietly. "Mr. Moretti," an officer barked. "You're under arrest for the murder of Isabella Moretti." Alexander raised his hand, revealing a pistol already in his grasp. One of the officers shouted, "Drop it!" But Alexander just smiled. "Loyalty has a price," he murmured. Then, without hesitation, he turned the gun on himself and pulled the trigger. The echo of the shot was louder than before. When the dust settled, the empire of Alexander Moretti fell with him. 3 years later, the case of Elijah Reed made national news. Public outcry demanded justice. A retrial was granted, and after 9 months of review, Elijah was formally exonerated and released. He was met outside the prison gates by Detective Hall. "You saved a man who didn't deserve it," she said. "Why?" Elijah looked out across the horizon. "Because once he saved me, and I thought maybe I owed him my life." Hall nodded. "You don't owe anyone anything anymore." But fate had one more twist. Unknown to Elijah, Alexander had quietly set up a trust fund years ago, an untraceable offshore account labeled E-Read. It held $97 million. Lawyers reached out. They explained that Alexander had left it to Elijah as a reward for his loyalty, or perhaps as a final attempt to balance the scales. Elijah took the money, and for the first time in his life, he bought a home, then a foundation, then businesses to employ men like him, forgotten, broken, loyal. The servant had become the billionaire. Elijah Reed stood outside Greenvale State Penitentiary, his hands free of cuffs for the first time in 11 years. The prison gates creaked behind him, as if trying to pull him back into the life he had finally left behind. He squinted at the sky. It was cloudy, but he didn't care. For most of his time behind bars, Elijah hadn't expected this day to come. He had quietly accepted his fate, convinced that his silence had protected the only man who had once saved him. But now, after the death of Alexander Moretti and the stunning court reversal, he was a free man. And with that freedom came something else, questions he had never allowed himself to ask. Waiting by a sleek black car stood Detective Marissa Hall. She had become something of a controversial hero after reopening the Moretti case, but she had never stopped thinking about Elijah. He approached her slowly, cautiously. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes, I did," she replied. "You're not walking back into nothing." She opened the passenger door. Elijah hesitated, then slid in. As the car pulled away from the prison, Marissa glanced at him. "You ever going to tell me why you really did it? Why you confessed?" Elijah stared out the window. "I made a promise, and I kept it." She shook her head. "That man let you rot. He watched you take the fall and never once lifted a finger." Elijah said nothing, but the weight in his chest was heavier than the prison walls ever were. A new beginning. 2 weeks later, Elijah sat in a high-rise office in Manhattan. The late Alexander Moretti's attorneys had tracked him down with a message that seemed too unreal to believe. Elijah was the sole heir to an offshore trust worth nearly $100 million. Alexander had planned it all before his death. Money moved quietly through shadow corporations and offshore accounts. It had only become traceable once Alexander died, and the lawyers were legally allowed to reveal the documentation. "This was always his backup plan," said Ronald Trent, the attorney managing the estate. "I think he knew the truth would come out one day. This was his way of saying thank you." Elijah didn't reply right away. He was still processing the fact that a man who had let him rot in prison had left him wealth beyond imagination. "What do you want to do with the money?" Trent asked. "I want to do something that means something," Elijah said. And that's exactly what he did. The Reed Foundation. Within 6 months, Elijah had established the Reed Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals, especially black men and women, get access to legal defense, mental health support, and reentry resources. He bought an old building in Brooklyn, renovated it into a sleek, state-of-the-art community hub. The name above the door said, "Justice Can't Wait." People began to notice. News outlets picked up the story of the servant who became a billionaire. His quiet strength, his humility, and his unwavering belief and loyalty earned him widespread admiration. But with attention came curiosity. Many want to know what kind of man would sit in prison for someone else's crime and never break. A visit from the past. One cold morning, a young woman named Juliana Moretti came to his office. She was the daughter of Alexander and Isabella, only 10 years old when her mother died. Raised away from the public eye, she had returned to the city after studying overseas. "I needed to see you," she said softly, sitting across from Elijah. He noticed how much she resembled her mother. Same sharp cheekbones, same fire in her eyes. "I don't remember much from that night," she continued. "But I remember you. You used to braid my hair in the mornings. You told me stories about jazz legends." Elijah smiled gently. "You were always curious." Juliana reached into her purse and placed a photo on his desk. It was of her, as a child, riding on Elijah's back in the mansion's garden. He was smiling, holding her up like a proud uncle. "My father, he did terrible things," she said. "But I don't want his shadow to define me. I want to be better. I want to help." Elijah leaned forward. "Then don't live in revenge. Live in purpose." She nodded. That day marked the beginning of a strange but healing alliance. Juliana began volunteering at the foundation, working on women's rights initiatives and mental health advocacy. Enemies in the shadows. But not everyone was happy with Elijah's rise. In the dark corners of the city, remnants of Moretti's Mafia network still lingered. Alexander's death had left a power vacuum, and some old associates believed Elijah knew more about the family's hidden assets. One such man was Nico Ventresca, a ruthless capo who had always distrusted Elijah. "He's got the money now," Nico growled to his crew. "What if he's got the files too? Names, offshore accounts. Stuff we don't want getting out." So they watched, tailed his car, followed Juliana, hacked into his emails. One night, as Elijah left his office alone, a black SUV pulled up beside him. A man stepped out, dressed in black, eyes cold. "Mr. Reed," he said, "boss wants a word." "I don't work for bosses anymore," Elijah replied calmly. The man stepped closer. "You're sitting on more than just a fortune. You know things people are willing to kill to keep quiet." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "You think I'd sit in prison for 11 years to betray someone now?" The man smirked. "Then prove it. Stay silent." The SUV peeled away, tires screeching. Elijah stood in the street, his heart pounding, but his face never changed. He had faced worse than threats. Rebuilding the future. Despite the danger, Elijah refused to live in fear. He hired security, protected Juliana, and ensured the Reed Foundation operated with full transparency. He used his influence to speak at universities, invest in clean housing projects, and support ex-cons who wanted to start over. But in private, he often sat alone, staring at a single photo. The day he arrived at the Moretti mansion for his first job, young, desperate, and unaware of what fate had in store. He had been a servant, then a scapegoat, then a prisoner. Now he was something else, not just a billionaire, but a man who had never traded his soul. A full circle. A year later, the governor of New York invited Elijah to deliver a keynote speech at the state capitol. His story had become symbolic, a powerful reminder that dignity could survive even the worst betrayals. As he stood on the grand podium, the crowd fell silent. "I was taught to keep my head down," he began, "to stay quiet, stay loyal, and stay invisible. But sometimes silence protects the wrong people. And sometimes loyalty becomes the chain that binds you to injustice. He paused, scanning the faces before him. I don't regret what I did. I regret that it was necessary. But every minute I spent in that cell taught me one thing. Freedom isn't about money or power. It's about knowing who you are and never letting the world take that away. The room erupted in applause. Elijah smiled. The servant had risen. The billionaire had spoken, and the world was finally listening. 2 years had passed since Elijah Reed walked out of prison and into a life few could imagine. The Reed Foundation had expanded nationally, his investments flourished, and he was featured on magazine covers, celebrated as one of the most inspiring comeback stories in the country. But behind the public applause, the shadows still lingered. The remnants of Alexander Moretti's criminal network had fractured after his death, but pieces remained, and those pieces were watching Elijah with quiet contempt. What angered them most wasn't his freedom, it was his success. The black man who once scrubbed their bosses' floors now stood atop the financial ladder, controlling assets they believed should have stayed within their circles. Nico Ventresca, now a rogue mafia figure, was growing bolder. His belief that Elijah had access to sensitive documents, ledgers, blackmail photos, and accounts hidden under Moretti's global empire fueled his obsession. In the back of a cigar lounge in Queens, Nico addressed his men with fury in his tone. He has the key, he growled. I know Moretti gave it to him. Somewhere in his files or memory, Elijah holds the codes to the offshore accounts we buried in Panama, Zurich, and Dubai. One of the younger soldiers leaned forward. Then we get to him. Tonight. Nico grinned. No, we do it smart. He has security, cameras, lawyers, but everyone's got one weakness. He held up a photo of Giuliano Moretti. A sudden disappearance. Elijah was in a meeting with the city mayor when his phone vibrated. Once, then twice. Then again. He reached down, recognizing the number. Juliana's assistant. Juliana's missing, the woman said in a trembling voice. She never showed up to the clinic this morning. She's not answering texts or calls. Elijah's pulse quickened. He ended the meeting abruptly and rushed to the foundation's security room. His team combed through the footage, tracing Juliana's last known movements. The trail stopped near a bookstore in Midtown, where she was last seen stepping into a black SUV. Elijah didn't call the police. Not yet. He knew how these things worked. If this was the mafia, she wouldn't be killed immediately. She'd be used. Or worse, the phone call. That evening, Elijah's private line rang. You've made quite a name for yourself, Nico's voice drawled. The world loves a good redemption story. But happy endings are for fairy tales, Elijah. What do you want? Elijah said, his voice like steel. Come alone. Bring the flash drive. You know which one. Pier 17. Midnight. Or Juliana becomes another ghost. Elijah said nothing. He hung up and sat still for a long time. Then, without calling security or alerting his staff, he walked to his office safe. Inside was a single flash drive, sealed in a steel case. Alexander had given it to him during the final days of the trial. He remembered the moment vividly. If anything ever happens to me, Alexander had whispered in a rare moment of vulnerability, this drive controls the vaults. It's not just money, it's power. Use it wisely or never. Elijah had buried the drive under documents, unsure whether he'd ever touch it again. Until now. Midnight at the pier. Rain fell hard as Elijah stepped out of a black sedan at Pier 17, dressed in a long overcoat, the flash drive in his pocket. The wind howled. Dock lights flickered like dying stars. Nico stood with 3 armed men beside a small boat. Juliana was tied to a steel chair, her lip bruised, her eyes defiant. Elijah Reed, Nico sneered, arms open, still playing the noble fool. Let her go. Let's not be hasty. I want what you have. The codes, the drive, and then maybe she walks. Elijah reached into his pocket and held up the flash drive. Good man, Nico said. Now toss it here. First she walks. Nico laughed. You're not giving the orders? But he didn't see Elijah's silent cue. A drone, small, nearly invisible in the rain, hovered overhead. Elijah had anticipated this. In a flash, red dots danced across Nico's chest. Snipers. FBI agents emerged from shipping containers, floodlights bursting on like lightning. Elijah had called in a favor. Detective Hall and the FBI Cyber Division were watching from a nearby van. "Drop your weapons," a voice shouted through a bullhorn. Nico's men froze. But the capo himself snarled and yanked Juliana up, holding a gun to her head. "You think this ends with me in cuffs?" he spat. "This isn't some courtroom drama." Before anyone could react, Juliana drove her heel into Nico's knee. He howled in pain. Elijah rushed forward, tackled him to the ground, and wrenched the gun from his hand. Seconds later, Nico was swarmed, cuffed, and shoved into a black van, screaming threats about blood and vengeance. Elijah pulled Juliana into his arms, heart racing. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded. "You came alone. Why?" "Because loyalty's only real if it costs you something." The real vault. In the aftermath of the arrest, Elijah gave the flash drive to the FBI. What they found was staggering. Moretti's personal ledgers, account passwords, locations of buried cash reserves, and blackmail files on politicians, judges, and global elites. The information led to the dismantling of multiple criminal networks and the arrests of over a dozen international suspects. The government offered Elijah a reward. He refused it, but Juliana took initiative. Using a small portion of Elijah's fortune and her share of the Moretti estate, she co-founded Vault Justice, a division of the Reed Foundation focused on helping international authorities expose hidden empires. Together, they were rewriting the legacy of a family built on blood. A conversation with the past. Months later, Elijah visited Alexander Moretti's grave. Alone. The sky was clear, the wind calm. He stood in silence for several minutes, then placed a single white rose on the grave. "I kept my promise," Elijah said softly, "but I won't lie for your memory anymore. The world knows who you were. And now, I'm trying to be better." He stared at the name on the marble. "Maybe somewhere in you, there's a man worth saving. But in the end, it was never about you. It was about what I stood for." He turned and walked away. And this time, he didn't look back. Legacy forged in fire. Elijah Reed's story became legend. Schools taught about the loyalty that saved lives. The courts cited his case in legal reform. And the very system that once failed him now used his foundation to prevent the next miscarriage of justice. He was invited to speak before the United Nations. He sat with presidents. He built schools, funded rehabilitation centers, and led global conversations about racial injustice and redemption. But he never stopped being the man who sharpened kitchen knives at 6 a.m. Never stopped dressing modestly. Never stopped listening before speaking. He had been a servant, a scapegoat, a prisoner. And now, he was a symbol, not of perfection, but of loyalty tested and dignity restored. Elijah Reed had become more than a man. He was a movement. From prison bars to billionaire boardrooms, his story was now etched into the soul of a nation. His journey had inspired millions, but the man behind the headlines remained humble, steady, and still haunted. 3 years had passed since the night at Pier 17. The Reed Foundation had expanded to 5 countries. Vault Justice, co-led by Juliana Moretti, now worked with the UN to unearth financial crimes and expose hidden corruption across borders. But with growth came scrutiny, and even more painful, loneliness. A man alone. At 59, Elijah's mornings still began at 5 a.m. He made his own breakfast, cleaned his own space, and ironed his shirts himself. Billionaire or not, the habit of self-discipline never left him. It was how he kept his mind clean, clear from the rot of power. But there were nights the silence gnawed at him. His family, long gone. No children, no wife. Even friends were few. Everyone around him now seemed to admire him, but didn't really know him. Except Juliana, Juliana's truth. One spring morning, she walked into his office holding a thick envelope. "I need to tell you something," she said, her eyes unsteady. Elijah looked up from a legal folder. "What is it?" "I found something in my mother's journals. Things she never told anyone." She sat down across from him and pulled out old, yellowed pages. On them were passages Isabella Moretti had written in the months before her death. Entries filled with fear, regret, and pain. She was planning to leave my father, Juliana whispered. But not just because she had fallen in love with someone else. She discovered something. A trafficking operation. International. My father was involved. She had proof, documents, bank accounts, photos. Elijah's eyes narrowed. She wasn't just cheating. She was trying to take him down, Juliana added. And that changed everything. All these years, Elijah had believed Isabella's betrayal was personal, a wound that drove Alexander to madness. But this was deeper. She had been a threat to the empire, a woman trying to do the right thing, and she had died for it. I don't think my father left you the fortune out of guilt, Juliana said softly. I think, deep down, he knew you were the only one who wouldn't become him. A final investigation. Haunted by this revelation, Elijah reopened the deepest layers of the flash drive Alexander had given him years ago. Hidden inside, encrypted folders were files far more sinister than he'd originally seen. Names of victims, ages, routes across borders, aliases of handlers, bribes to foreign authorities. It was all there. Moretti hadn't just built a mafia empire. He had run one of the largest underground trafficking syndicates in the Western Hemisphere. And Isabella had uncovered it. That's why she died. Not because of infidelity, because she tried to be brave. Turning over the darkness, Elijah contacted Vault Justice and the FBI. For the next 9 months, a joint international task force quietly gathered evidence, cross-referencing data from the flash drive with global intel. What unfolded was historic. Over 200 arrests in 11 countries. 50 missing children recovered. 12 politicians forced to resign. $4 billion in illegal assets seized. And, at the heart of it all, a man who had once pushed a mop in silence. Elijah Reed. The book deal offer. After the operation's success, major publishers flooded his inbox with offers. One wanted to turn his life into a novel. Another wanted a miniseries. Netflix, HBO, even Spielberg Studio reached out. But Elijah turned them all down. His words were simple. This story was never meant to entertain. He finally agreed to let Juliana write a book. Not about him, but about Isabella. The Rose That Grew in a Mafia Garden became a bestseller. A tribute to the woman whose truth cost her life. Honored by the president. One autumn afternoon, Elijah stood in the rose garden of the White House. The President of the United States pinned a medal on his chest, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. As applause echoed through the crowd, Elijah simply said, "I didn't ask for any of this. I just refused to stop being me." Returning home. But even with the accolades, Elijah longed for peace. One day, without warning, he left New York, left the cameras, the boardrooms, the events. He purchased a small house in rural Georgia, quiet, humble, surrounded by pine trees and the sound of birds instead of sirens. Neighbors knew who he was, but they respected his silence. He'd often sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise, lost in thought. Sometimes Juliana would visit. She had become more than a partner in the foundation. She was like family now, perhaps the only one he had left. The letter. One morning, Elijah received a letter in an unfamiliar envelope. It was from the son of a man who had been one of Moretti's soldiers, one of the many who had stayed silent for years. Inside the envelope were photographs of Elijah in prison, of him sweeping floors, reading books, smiling faintly, and a note. "My father said you were the only good man in a world of wolves." He kept these as a reminder that even the dark had light in it. Elijah stared at the photos for a long time. He hadn't cried in years, but that day he did, not out of pain, out of peace. Legacy in stone. Years later, after Elijah passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 74, the world mourned. Not with grand parades or national holidays, but with acts of goodness. In every country the Reed Foundation touched, candles were lit. Prisoners were freed. Homes were built. And children were saved. His headstone in Georgia read, "Elijah Reed, servant, witness, redeemer." He bore the blame and still built justice. And beside his grave was a rose bush planted by Juliana. A rose that grew despite the blood-soaked soil. Epilogue. The Reed Foundation became the largest non-governmental criminal justice nonprofit in the world. Its headquarters in Brooklyn was renamed the Elijah Reed Justice Center. Inside the main hall, etched in granite, were his most famous words. Loyalty may cost you everything, but if it's rooted in truth, it will give the world back to you. And beside it, a photo, Elijah holding Juliana's hand at the Pier 17 rescue. Smiling, alive, free, forever.